My name is John Waters, and I currently live in Marston's Mills. Well, one of the beautiful things about the town of Barnstable is that there are 7 different villages, and every village in the town has a uniqueness about it. I was lucky when I was about 8, 9 years old. My family owned a big house on the Centerville River that they ran as a guest house property. It was called the Holly Hill Guest House. And we get the same people coming back every year from New York. So I spent summers on the Centerville River, but I was in Camaquid in the wintertime, so I always joke how I had a pretty nice life where I was able to winter in Camaquid and summer on the Centerville River. So they're all great. Cotuit I have a lot of fond memories and friends that grew up in Cotuit, and of course going to like the Cape League games way back and right through to today is a great thing I like to do. That's interesting because, as I say, we had the same people coming back every year. So I actually developed friendships and relationships with their children. And we'd look forward to going to the Barnstable County Fair. And I had a postcard concession in the lobby where I'd sell my postcards, which is kind of interesting. I still do a lot of postcard searching today with a Facebook page that I do. So I'd sell the postcards, 5 for a quarter, and that's how I financed my way to the county fair. Yeah, I don't think you can count the postcards as a first job. I don't think I had any Social Security or anything taken out of my wages. My first real job, although I did work for 1 year cleaning the grounds and cleaning the swimming pool at the Patrician Motel, which back in the day when the Mary Dunn Road went all the way from Camaquid 6A right out to Route 132 where the furniture stores are now. The Patrician was right there. It was a maybe 30, 40 room motel, and I would work there. The family friends owned it. But my real first job that I got on my own was at a place called the Cape Cod Ranch in Camaquid. It's kind of a unique property. It was built to be a dude ranch in the 1940s by the Van Duzers, who still live over there, and Millway Marine. People know them of that fame. The dude ranch was, actually they used to send a stagecoach to the Yarmouthport train station and pick up the guests and bring them to the Cape Cod Ranch, and they would ride horses, and they would bring in professional rodeo stars to put on demonstrations and things like that. It's amazing what I've been able to find out there about the Cape Cod Ranch. The Cape Cod Ranch became there was 2 guys from Taunton, 2 brothers-in-law, Stan Jubeck and Matty Sokolowski. They were in the silver plating business in Taunton. And they decided that what better opportunity for a couple of Polish guys from Taunton than to open a Swedish smorgasbord in Camaquid. So they opened the Cape Cod Ranch, and I started working there when I was a freshman in high school, working in the kitchen, washing pots and pans. It was a very big family run between the Sokolowskis and the Jubecks, and then the chef was a guy named Roger Therian, who was a chef at a sorority down at Yukon, and every year he'd bring his whole family of 5 or 6 up, and they'd wait on tables, so it was a big family affair. Great place to work. Worked there all 4 years. A lot of fond memories. What better place than to work at some spot that had its own private beach where you could have a bonfire after work each night, go for a swim. So it was pretty special. It was off the beaten path back then. You had Leslie Ryder's cornfields that you had to wend your way through. They were like massive cornfields, especially late July and August. And you'd get down to the end of Harbor Point Road, and that's where the Harbor Point restaurant still is today. But people would come. The smorgasbords had like 60 items, including fresh striped bass and roast beef and lobster Newburg, 60 different items. When I started there, I think it was $3.95 all you could eat. So people would pack the place for the 70 days a year that it was open. Well, I think lot of, lot of people here on the Cape get into this food service industry in one way, shape, or form. It's an easy way to have fun at work and meet lots of friends, and usually you always get a meal out of it too. So that was not a bad thing either. I worked in many different places. I worked at the old Mildred's Charter House when I was in the mid 1970s, actually during the bicentennial. We were busboys, and a couple of my fellow busboys own restaurants here on the Cape as we speak. So we all worked there, and there was 60 waitresses to mingle with every night, and it was just a fun time, great place to work. And I worked at the Windjammer. My 7th grade English teacher, Peter Feeney, offered me a job bartending there one time, and of course, I worked there for many years, bartending downstairs. Barnstable High School was, certainly a little bit different than it is today. It wasn't quite as big. Actually, at that point in time, the vocational school was on the grounds as well, and they kept everybody a little bit separated from that. It was, for many kids that lived in the outlying villages, going into Hyannis first for the junior high school and then the high school, that was kind of a culture shock. You got to meet everybody in town. Barnstable High School was, I think, a pretty good school. The teachers there, there's a teacher, Jim Roberti, who ran the theater department there, that I'm still very, very close with. We speak with each other quite a bit. He was kind of my mentor in getting me into theater. I've done a lot of theater on the Cape over the last 45 years, directing and acting. And although I was involved with it before I met Jim Roberti, he certainly was very influential in keeping me down that hobby in my life. I haven't done anything at the Barnstable Comedy Club in probably 3 or 4 years. I've been off and on with the board of directors over there. I've directed about probably close to 20 plays over there in my lifetime. I started doing theater there probably about 1978, and over those 30 some plus years, I've been fairly active over there.
Sure.
It's a
Who are
great.
some of the people you work with?
I've worked with a lot of wonderful people. When I first started working there, doing theater there, it was still back in the old days. Of course, Kurt Vonnegut was the president when they founded the actual Barnstable Comedy Club, and the Comedy Club bought the building in 1960. Kurt Vonnegut was the president. There were people like Doris St. Kerr, who were Charlie House's mother-in-law, and Sally Sawyer, who from Cotuit, a spinster lady who I was shocked one day watching the Oscars when somebody who won an award thanked Sally Sawyer for. So she was a luminary in the theater. It was a great, it's the oldest community theater on the Cape. It was. They started doing shows there in 1922, and coming up on bearing down on their 100th anniversary coming up. Oh, best character I ever played. I have a few that I like. I played Moonface Martin, the gun-toting gangster in Anything Goes. That was a lot of fun. I've done Petruchio only under duress. Petruchio actually in Kiss Me Kate only under duress because the person who had the part couldn't learn their lines, so I got thrown into the lead with just a few weeks to go, thanks to Jim Roberti. That was fun. I certainly don't have a voice that can sing 11 songs, though, I'll tell you that. There's been a lot of great roles and great characters over there. Well, there was certainly Were Thine Those Special Eyes is kind of a torchy ballad, and I had no right to sing that song. And the music director, I don't know why, but she refused to rearrange it so that it could be in my key, so I died a slow death every night singing that. And of course, my leading lady, Ann Davis, Phyllis Ann of Hollywood from back in those days at Barnstable, when we went to Barnstable High School together, she was a very accomplished singer and wasn't appreciative of that they threw in somebody who could learn the lines but not sing the songs to play opposite her. Paul Prescott was the principal when I started there as a freshman. He had just came into the school, so he was new there as well, and he was trying to be an authoritarian figure, but also be a friend to everybody as much as possible. We had some great hockey team back then. When I went to Barnstable High School, it wasn't until my junior year that the Barnstable High School varsity, that was being coached by Elliot McSwan, lost their very first hockey game ever. They went 9 seasons undefeated. And I always remember it was against Falmouth. They lost 1-0, and it was just a heartbreaker, and everybody's world was shaken. But they came back and they won the afterwards. A couple of years later, going back with the hockey, Johnny Hurley and Bobby and Billy Moore and the Scudder boys, they had a state champion team that was just phenomenal. That was a couple of years after I graduated, 1972, and they were a powerhouse. Johnny Hurley especially, up there in Boston Garden, hitting slap shots from the blue line. So, Alice Williams, boy, everybody has a very fond place in their heart for Alice. She was a great teacher. She was in the junior high school when I was there, and then when I went to high school, she came up to the high school. She was always into theater before everybody else was, and she was just a dear-hearted person. We were very sorry we lost her a few years back. Isn't that amazing? What a wonderful benefactor for the Centerville Library. I have some great friends that became really good friends with Alice when they were past high school, and they became lifelong friends too. That's an amazing thing when that friendship with a teacher and a student, and you have so much in common over the years that it creates long-term, life-lasting friendships. I lived on the corner of Route 6A and Bone Hill Road in Cumberquid, a big gray house. My parents bought that house. I have a copy of the deed, 1948. 12 rooms on Route 6A with a big barn in the rear. They bought it for $9,800. We lived there right through the 1970s. Both my parents worked for the county. My father worked for the House of Correction for 37 years. And my mother worked at the Registry of Deeds for about 30 years. So when I went to elementary school at Barnstable, West Barnstable Elementary School, and I would get dropped off and hang out at just outside the jailhouse or down at the courthouse waiting for my parents to get out at 4:30. But it was a different Barnstable village. The House of Correction was a little bit different in those days. Honestly, my father used to take me in there to lunch. So it's not quite as, we don't think he'd be doing that today up in Bourne. My mother's dad was a Main Street Hyannis attorney. His name was Robert E. French. He moved here in the 1920s to become the recorder at Land Court. And he built a house that was so far outside of Hyannis that he always told me that he had to buy the telephone poles to run the electricity out to it. Well, I just recently, I also do the Barnstable Patriot Early Files, and I just recently in the last month came across a little article about that, and I found that my grandfather was not telling the whole truth the whole time. He did indeed. The house that he built so far outside of Hyannis is where Sam Diego's restaurant is today, and as a matter of fact, the chimney is the original chimney. I found a little snippet saying that the Cape and Islands Electric Company, they indeed put in 25 telephone poles to run electricity and utilities all the way out that far down Route 132. But they did it for free. He didn't have to pay for them. So I've always laughed because it's one of his longest stories was how he had to pay for the telephone poles. But he had his office right here on Main Street, Hyannis. It was over the top of Schaubelt's, which everybody kind of knows as the Italian restaurant these days. Alberto's. He was a Republican, a staunch Republican. Of course, the polarity of the parties back in those days kind of switched as where they would their beliefs that they want. Today's a Democrat is probably more Republican than a Republican is Democrat, if you know what I mean. It's always interesting finding little snippets about him. After he moved out of the house on Route 132, he bought a house that was right in between the two Crosby boatyards in Osterville, which is now Bill Koch's Nauticus Marina. And the house didn't look like Nauticus Marina in those days. It was pretty plain white and austere and kind of ramshackled, and it had a beautiful little boathouse right out in front, which I'd fish for minnows off of, and have great pictures of my parents hanging out there. And that boathouse has now been moved up to the Osterville Historical Museum. It was Crosby's boathouse, obviously before my grandfather's stewardship of 30, 40 years. Yeah. But yeah, he was an amazing man. I remember reading about he was a GOP committee man for Cape Cod. He'd go to the big national conventions representing Cape Cod. And I remember one election, he didn't think he was getting enough support, so he went over to Mashpee and talked an entire 2 or 3 families to dress in their Native American attire and ride on a flatbed truck down Main Street, Hyannis, for a political rally. Then I say, what very resourceful guy. That's what you really call grassroots campaigning right there. It's interesting. When I was a kid, when I was really, really small, I remember my parents and my grandparents, there was always an emphasis that I was a Cape Codder, first and foremost, before anything else. Being a Cape Codder was something special, at least in their minds, and I've grown to appreciate that too. But being a Cape Codder, I've always had a fascination for the area. Strangely enough, growing up in Comaquid, my neighbors across the street were Percy and Barbara Williams, whose family owned the Barnstable Patriot. So I kind of always heard the clacking of the typewriter over there on summer afternoons as Barbara would be writing on the paper. I never really had any kind of background in newspaper writing. I started working in newspapers mostly in circulation, and somebody said, you know, geez, you should review theater since you do so much theater. So back in the days for the Register newspaper, I would do an occasional theater review. And then when my son was born, I got out of that and I got into business selling cars. And when my son was born, my wife had the benefits. So she said, why don't you be Mr. Mom and I'll go back to work. So there I was with my son had just graduated from Sturgis Charter School. He's going to be 18 years old next month. And so 18 years ago, I was home being Mr. Mom. And the guys from the Register called me up and said, hey, listen, Seth Rolbein and Dan Hamilton, why don't you cover Barnstable Town Hall for us, since you're not doing anything as Mr. Mom? So I said, well, how would I do that? All I've ever done is theater. And he said, there isn't a bigger theater on Cape Cod than Barnstable Town Hall. So I said, okay, I'll give it a try. And I remember my first session coming into this room, and it was something to do with the Steamship Authority and whether they were getting okay to do something around the harbor. And I knew all the players, so I just started writing about it, and it was enjoyable. Having grown up here, I did know who all the players were, whether or not I knew them on a first name basis. They kind of knew who I was too, and so it was a nice fit. During that tenure with the Register, the tragic death of JFK Jr. happened, and of course the entire world press descends on Hyannisport anytime there's a Kennedy death or tragedy. And I remember going down there, and all around me were reporters from Brazil and Spain, and they were literally the world. And it was swelteringly hot. And anybody who's tried to cover one of those events, There's a whole lot of nothing that goes on for a long period of time. The Kennedys grieve in private. You stand out there, you wait for an occasional car to come by. And I kept saying, it's way too hot to be standing here. I got someplace I got to go, which actually is one of my favorite places on Cape Cod. And so I went over to the north side, went for a swim, figured, well, I could save some time. The next morning I went down to Hyannis Port, probably about 6 o'clock in the morning, and all the satellite trucks were there. And I looked at, there sitting on his porch, at the tower of his porch was Sam Barber, just feverishly painting away the scene of Hyannis Port, which could be on the walls here in this room. He's painted it a million times, the background of Hyannis Port. But all the satellite trucks were not in it, he was painting away. So I stopped and I started talking to him about his relationship with JFK Jr. and of course JFK's mother Jackie. And he had just wonderful stories. Well, to make a long story short, I filed my story and I ended up winning the Massachusetts Press Association Award for best story of being able to time and place and all of that. So it was kind of fun being there with the World Press and snagging a little bit of prize for myself out of that. Yeah, or wherever, Barnstable Village, wherever. It's funny because my son went to the Sturgis Charter School, the East Campus, and he just got his International Baccalaureate degree, which was fabulous for him to attain. And they teach there such a wanderlust of seeing the world. And he got to go in his junior year on a school trip to Germany and Czechoslovakia and Poland to visit the concentration camps of all things. And he was bitten by that, and he wanted to immediately go the next year. And I'm saying, well, okay, you can afford it, go for it. But just recently, when he just graduated, I said, do you think you're going to stay on Cape Cod? And he said, well, I think I want to see a little bit of the world, but this is my home, and that's it's you kind of once you've been here for a while, you want to stay here if you can. And that's
his college choice.
He's going to the University of Massachusetts in Lowell. So he's doing he's going to be majoring in English theater arts, which I was kind of down against, which is kind of weird since I've got about a 45-year history in theater here on the Cape. But he actually wrote a musical for his senior international baccalaureate project, and they put it on, and he wrote it in the other room clacking away, and I never even asked him what it was he was doing. And then when I saw the play, a musical, I said, okay, go for it. You've got a talent for that, and that's what you should do if you really want to. So, just that he'll have to find some other job, more than likely to make the money. But no, it's good. It's funny. I did so much theater before my son was born. When he was born, it became very difficult to fit the two together, only on brief periods of time. And I got to direct him in a production of Waiting for Godot a few years back. And then after that, anytime I said, hey, you want to do a theater project? He said, well, I got one going on my own with the school. So we kind of very rarely got to do a whole lot of theater together except that one time. But yeah, whatever he wants to do. The Cape is hard. The Cape is hard. It's been hard for not just the last 50 years. I think the Cape has been a hard place for men and women to sustain living here for hundreds of years. There isn't a lot of business other than tourism and at those days fishing and agriculture. There was no factories per se, although so it always was a hard place to stay. I have definitely get my quahog license, but not every year. I kind of stopped doing that. It's not as good as it used to be. You used to be able to go down a Scudder Lane, and there was an old breakwater there or a jetty that was kind of submerged. And remember my father teaching me back in the early 1960s that there was a freshwater spring that came up. It was submerged about 100 feet out at high tide, and it's still there today. You could actually get a scoop of fresh water out of the bottom there when you went shell fishing. Fishing too. I love to go surf casting. Never been big on boats in my adult lifehood. We had a lot of boats when I was a kid and stuff like that. And my mother was a tremendous fisherman, and her trick was, growing up between the two Crosby boatyards, she was always in a boat, and her thing was she'd take a white feathered lure and she'd take her red lipstick and she'd smear the feathers with the lipstick, and it would look just like a bloody piece of flesh to the stripers, and they would hit it like crazy, and she'd always come home with more fish than the men. There's so few. Well, winter takes up about 7 months, doesn't it? I mean, and it's nice to have the Cape to ourselves, if that is such a thing anymore. But summer is so beautiful and it's intoxicating, but it lasts so short. Obviously, the fall is just the best time to be here. Always has been. It really is a time when people, I think, reflect. I think it's always been the reset time for everybody. The tourists would leave, the schools would start back up again, and everybody would get back into their lives. But the summer's pretty special when you can capture it. Most exciting. There's been many exciting days that I've lived through in the town of Barnstable. One that comes to mind, back in 1960, to give you just a little bit of how I got into doing theater, was that I was born flat-footed. I had to wear steel arches. It would take a train from Yarmouthport to Boston Children's Hospital to get the steel arches. Because of that, I wasn't as very coordinated. So my mother said, well, the best way to get somebody coordinated is to have them take ballet. So at the time, the Cape Cod Conservatory was in the old schoolhouse building in Barnstable Village. That's where the conservatory started. And they had a ballet class. So I went to the first one, and I realized like I was the only boy there, and it was kind of odd. I'd have my little shoebox with ballet slippers riding on the Cumberquid Chief, and I'd get dropped off there. Well, I really didn't want any part of that, so I'd sit out on the back steps and not go in, and then when it was time to go home, I'd go home. Kind of Opie Taylor kind of setting, and it didn't take long for my mother caught on saying, what's going on? And rather than lose her money, she stuck me in a drama class. So Mrs. Ashley was the lady who taught theater for the conservatory, and that's how my first affiliation or taste of theater. So this was like in the late 1950s. In 1959, they used to do big shows at the Melody Tent, and they did a show. They did Carousel, and it was the first show that I was really ever involved in. They had costumes and lights, and it was summer theater. It was amazing, and it was right around the 4th of July, and the Melody Tent had a parade in the 4th of July, had a float in the 4th of July parade. And in the play, I got to have a thing of cotton candy. And the theatrical version of cotton candy is made out of spun glass. So you touch it wrong, you're getting these little filaments of glass in your fingernails. And in the play, I got to ride on one of the only actual carousel horses that went around the stage. So I figured, that's mine. I mean, that's what I did in the show. Well, when it came time to do the parade, the leading lady who played Louisa, they stuck her on the hobby horse, and I was pretty miffed about that. So it was a fun thing being in the 4th of July parade as an 8-year-old for the Melody Tent, but at the same time I wanted to ride that horse. I think the core values of the town of Barnstable have pretty much always been the same. I mean, there's good education. I mean, Barnstable knew early on that education was a really important thing. This building we're sitting in here doing this interview was, Hyannis was always a college town. This was built in 1895 to be the state normal school. They became Hyannis State Teachers College after that, and then Mass Maritime. So Hyannis was always a college town, and this was Cape Cod Community College in the 1960s before they moved out to the 132 campus. So the education has been good. I've been lucky. I grew up over at St. Mary's Episcopal Church in Barnstable. It's a church that I still go to, and my son still acolytes occasionally, and I think a lot of the people that I've known through the years, they've all been, the local churches are good foundations for them. Sustaining livelihoods has always been the problem, always will be a problem. I remember a few years back they decided this was going to be the Silicon Sandbar, and all this high-tech companies were going to move in here, and that never really panned out. It kind of, the sandbar eroded away. Obviously there's problems in Hyannis. The problems are modern day problems, I think, because of the drugs and stuff that are out there today. The opiates are a huge problem. But one of the things doing the early files, this always, every night you see in the news how there's something happened on Main Street, Hyannis. Something's always happened on Main Street, Hyannis. During World War II, the servicemen would come in from Camp Edwards, and they'd have a few drinks, and they'd be dancing with the girls at here at the Hyannis USO, and there was always, it was a party town. It was a party village. That's why it is a resort area. People came here to enjoy Cape Cod. Serious problems, though, that have to be addressed, because I think it's a fine line that Barnstable shoulders of being the main center of the social services and being the economic hub of the Cape as well. They seem to be butting heads with each other all the time, and we have to figure out a way to make that work better. And I don't know what that is, but we need to keep working for that. Well, he'd say, "Who's over there?" Because he actually, my grandfather was an attorney, and when people couldn't pay him, he'd take pieces of land in return. And he actually owned a large chunk of the north side of Route 132 in one time. And all the way from where the airport rotary would be, all the way down past to where Sam Diego's would be. He had some sort of ownership with it in the old days. It was a pine barren. It was a pine barren when I was a kid. When they built the Cape Cod Mall in 1970, before that, there was not much there. There was a place called Picture Pond Plaza, in which Abercrombie and Fitch decided to move their store off of Main Street, Hyannis, to this new shopping facility. Of course, Storyland was there, a child amusement park that was built like 1955. It's still remnants of it. They moved it up to New Hampshire. That was a pretty an amazing place. So I think he'd be happy to see the business developed. I think he'd probably be disgusted with a little bit too much asphalt, but I don't know how you get around that these days. He came from northern Vermont, and northern Vermont was a little bit too slow for him, so he ended up here in Hyannis because he thought this would be a little bit more action, and I think he found it, and he realized it was a special place. So that's why we stayed here. John Waters, and I currently live in Marston's Mills.